The wagon listed hard against the salt cedar, its wheels half buried in the alkaline dust of the Gila River Trail, and inside, curled beneath a tattered blanket stained with blood and sweat, lay a girl barely 16 winters old, her belly swollen with child, her lips cracked and moving in a whispered prayer that no god of the white man or the Apache seemed willing to hear. The discovery came at dawn, when Silas Thorne, former cavalry scout, current exile, perpetual guardian of his own hollow silence, rode out to check his trap lines and found instead this testament to the desert's cruelty. The girl's eyes, dark and fever-bright, fixed on him with a terror so primal it seemed to reach back through the years and grasp at something buried deep in his chest, something he had sworn never to feel again. The Arizona Territory in 1883 was a land of absolutes. A man was either civilized or savage, righteous or damned, and the space between was measured in rifle shots and shallow graves. Silas had chosen neither side, or perhaps both sides had chosen to forget him. His cabin sat in the shadow of the Chiricahua Range, far from Fort Apache and farther still from the settlement of New Canaan, where hymns and judgment flowed with equal fervor. He had learned his trade tracking Apache raiders for the cavalry, learned it so well that he could read a week-old trail like scripture, could smell water 3 miles distant, could survive on prickly pear and jerked venison when supplies ran thin. But all that skill had not saved his sister Emma, who had died in childbirth at 19, cast out by their God-fearing family for the sin of loving a man they deemed unworthy. The midwife had arrived too late. The child had not survived. Emma's last words, whispered to Silas as the light left her eyes, had been a plea for forgiveness that he had no power to grant. The girl in the wagon was Mescalero Apache. Her clothing and the turquoise beads in her hair proclaimed it, but her condition suggested something more complicated. She had been abandoned here, that much was certain, left to die or to seek mercy from a world that had none to spare. When Silas lifted her from the wagon bed, she flinched, her hand moving instinctively to protect her unborn child. And in that gesture he saw Emma again, saw the protective curve of her arms, the desperate hope that had never quite left her face. The girl's fever burned through the wool blanket. Her breathing came in shallow gasps. Without intervention, she would be dead by nightfall and the child with her. The ride back to his cabin took an hour, the girl barely conscious against his chest. Her weight slight despite the burden she carried. Silas did not consider his decision a moral choice. Morality was a luxury of towns and churches, places where men could afford to debate the finer points of right and wrong over whiskey and tobacco. Out here, in the borderland between the Apache and the Anglos, between the past and whatever future the territory might hold, there was only survival and the ghosts that survival demanded you carry. He had failed Emma. He would not fail again. The cabin revealed itself slowly to the girl's returning consciousness, rough-hewn pine walls, a stone fireplace blackened by years of smoke, the smell of coffee and gun oil and the peculiar dusty sweetness that clung to everything in the high desert. Silas had laid her on his only bed, a narrow wooden frame strung with leather and covered with blankets that had seen better decades. He watched from across the room as awareness returned to her eyes, watched the calculation that followed, the assessment of threat and escape routes that any Apache child learned before they learned to walk. Her hand remained on her belly, protective, defiant. For 3 days she said nothing. Silas tended the fever with willow bark tea and cool cloths, brought her broth made from rabbit and wild onions, left water within reach and maintained a careful distance. He understood that trust, if it came at all, would come slowly, earned in the spaces between words. On the 4th morning she spoke, her voice rough from disuse but clear in its intent. She would not go to the settlement. She knew what waited there, the righteous fury of men who believed their God gave them dominion over all things, the cold calculation of women who saw in her condition a moral failing worthy of damnation. They would take the child, she said, give it to some barren Christian couple to raise in ignorance of its blood, its people, its name. Better to die here, in this stranger's cabin, than to surrender to that fate. Silas understood. His sister had faced similar judgment, Though the specifics differed, Emma had loved a traveling preacher, a man of eloquence and empty promises, who had departed when her condition became evident. Their father, a hard man made harder by the unforgiving soil of Illinois, had offered her a choice: confess her sin before the congregation and beg forgiveness, or leave. Emma had chosen to leave. She had chosen wrong, or perhaps there had been no right choice, only variations of suffering. The memory of her grave, unmarked and lonely on the edge of their property, had driven Silas west, away from family and faith and everything that smelled of hypocrisy dressed in Sunday cloth. The girl's name, she revealed in careful Apache punctuated with broken Spanish, was Zeta, the found one. The bitter irony was not lost on either of them. She had been found by her people as an infant, orphaned by cholera, raised within the clan's fierce protection until she had committed the unforgivable transgression of lying with someone forbidden. She would not name the father, and Silas did not ask. The tribe's justice had been swift and absolute. Exile, abandonment, the severing of all bonds. The wagon and supplies had been a final gesture, mercy and cruelty intertwined, a chance at survival that assumed she would seek help from the whites. But Zeta knew better. She had seen how the soldiers and settlers treated Apache women, had heard the stories of children stolen, cultures erased, identities rewritten in the language of civilization. Silas demonstrated his value through action rather than words. He showed her how to recognize the healing properties of local plants, the ones that could ease pain and reduce fever, the ones that could kill if administered wrong. He taught her the patterns of the territory, where water ran year-round, where game congregated, which trails led to safety and which to ambush. In return, she shared knowledge he lacked: the proper preparation of mesquite beans, the identification of roots that could sustain them when meat was scarce, the reading of weather signs in the behavior of ravens and the color of distant clouds. Their communication developed its own rhythm, a pigeon of necessity that bridged the canyon between their worlds. But the outside world would not be denied. New Canaan was only 15 miles distant, close enough that smoke from Silas's chimney could be spotted by vigilant eyes, close enough that his occasional visits for supplies had been noted and filed away in the collective memory of a town that thrived on suspicion. The first visitor arrived on a Tuesday morning, a rider bearing the silver badge of a territorial deputy and the righteous certainty of a man convinced that law and morality were synonyms. He had heard, he said, that Silas was harboring an Indian woman. He had come, he said, to offer assistance in returning her to proper authorities, where her child could be delivered safely and placed with a Christian family prepared to raise it in the light of God's grace. Silas met him in the yard, his Winchester cradled in the crook of his arm, not threatening but present, a statement of intent more eloquent than any words. The deputy's eyes narrowed, searching the cabin's shadowed interior, seeking confirmation of the rumors that had set New Canaan abuzz with scandal and speculation. From inside came no sound, Zeta having learned to read danger in the quality of silence, in the shift of her protector's posture. The standoff lasted less than a minute, but in that minute the lines were drawn, boundaries established. Silas spoke only once. The woman was under his protection. She was not a prisoner, and any attempt to remove her would be met with the same resistance he would offer to anyone threatening his property, his freedom, or his conscience. The deputy left, but the dust of his departure carried a promise. This was not over. Word spread through New Canaan like fever, each retelling adding new layers of scandal. Silas Thorne, the hermit scout, the man who had turned his back on civilization, was now openly consorting with a savage, protecting her against the righteous will of both God and government. Reverend Absalom Price, whose church stood at the town's center like a white-painted beacon of absolute truth, denounced the arrangement from his pulpit, his voice carrying through open doors to the street beyond. An Apache woman, pregnant and abandoned by her own kind, represented everything the frontier needed to overcome: godlessness, licentiousness, the corrupting influence of savage blood. For Silas to shield her was to embrace damnation, to choose the darkness over the light. The congregation murmured its agreement, secure in their collective righteousness, never questioning whether mercy might wear a different face than the one they recognized in their looking glasses. Captain Josiah Bell, commanding officer of the cavalry detachment at Fort Apache, viewed the situation through a different lens, one ground smooth by years of frontier warfare and the brutal calculus of conquest. Silas Thorne was a traitor to his race, a man who had chosen Indian welfare over the manifest destiny of white civilization. The girl was likely a spy, her pregnancy a ruse designed to infiltrate, to gather intelligence, to undermine the fragile peace that existed only through overwhelming force and constant vigilance. That Silas had once served with distinction meant nothing. Every man carried within him the seeds of betrayal, and the frontier had a way of making those seeds bloom into flowers of treachery. The captain began making plans, consulting with the good Reverend Price, finding common cause in the elimination of a problem that threatened both their authorities, secular and divine. Inside the cabin, Tseta felt the weight of the approaching storm. Her time was near, the child moving with increasing urgency, her body preparing for the ordeal that no preparation could truly ready anyone to face. She looked at the scarred man who had taken her in, seeking to understand what drove him, what past wound made him willing to risk everything for a stranger's unborn child. When she asked in halting words cobbled together from 3 languages, Silas finally spoke of Emma, of the choice that was no choice, of the grave that haunted his dreams. Understanding passed between them then, a recognition that they were bound not by affection but by shared knowledge of what it meant to be cast out, to be deemed unworthy by those who claimed moral authority. They were 2 people the world had already written off as lost, and in that condemnation they found a strange, defiant freedom. The posse arrived on a Saturday, 12 men strong, led by Reverend Price's son-in-law and blessed by both church and cavalry. They came under the guise of civil concern, bearing papers that claimed legal authority to remove one pregnant Apache female for her own welfare and the welfare of her unborn child, said child to be placed immediately under territorial protection pending identification of appropriate Christian custodians. The papers were signed by a territorial judge who had never seen Tseta, never heard her voice, never considered that her will might factor into the equation of her own fate. In the worldview of New Canaan, will was something you possessed only insofar as it aligned with the will of God, as interpreted by Reverend Price, and by extension, by the men who carried his water and enforced his vision of righteousness. Silas saw them coming from a distance, the dust cloud announcing their approach long before the riders themselves became visible. 12 men meant this was serious, meant they expected resistance, meant they were prepared to overcome it. He loaded the Winchester with deliberate care, checking the action, ensuring each cartridge seated properly, his movements automatic from decades of practice. This was not the first time he had faced down men convinced of their own righteousness, and he knew from bitter experience that conviction made men dangerous, made them willing to do things they would later rationalize as necessary, as the price of maintaining order in a chaotic world. Inside, Tseta prepared in her own way, gathering the few possessions she had brought with her. The turquoise beads, a small leather pouch containing herbs and sacred items, a knife whose edge she had maintained with religious devotion. If they took her, she would not go quietly. If they took the child, she would ensure they understood the cost of that theft. Her culture had taught her the value of fighting when fighting meant something, of choosing death over dishonor, of making your enemies work for every victory. The child moved within her, strong kicks that promised life and struggle in equal measure. She placed her hand on her belly and whispered words in Apache, promises and prayers to spirits that might or might not be listening, that might or might not care about the troubles of one exile caught between worlds. The confrontation began with false courtesy, the son-in-law dismounting and approaching with papers in hand, his smile the practiced emptiness of a man following a script. He spoke of Christian charity, of the opportunities that awaited an innocent child if properly guided, of the danger inherent in allowing a savage woman to raise a child in conditions of moral and physical deprivation. Silas listened without expression, his rifle resting across his thighs, his eyes tracking the movements of the other riders as they spread out in a loose semicircle, boxing in the cabin, cutting off escape routes. This was strategy, not rescue. This was conquest dressed in the language of care. The son-in-law made the mistake of reaching for the cabin door. Silas moved faster than a man his age should have been able to move, the Winchester rising, its muzzle coming to rest inches from the younger man's chest. The message required no elaboration. The papers fluttered from nerveless fingers, settling in the dust like dead birds. For a long moment, 12 rifles pointed at one man, and one rifle pointed back, and the mathematics of violence hung in the air, waiting for someone to make the calculation that would transform potential into kinetic energy, waiting for blood to write the final answer. Reverend Price's son-in-law found his voice, tried to inject steel into words that came out trembling. The law was the law. The child deserved Christian mercy. Silas Thorne was obstructing justice, harboring a fugitive, placing himself beyond the pale of civilized society. The threats accumulated like thunderheads, dark and promising storms. But Silas had lived through worse storms, had learned that most men, when forced to choose between their convictions and their continued existence, discovered suddenly that their convictions had more flexibility than they had previously assumed. The standoff broke when Zeta appeared in the doorway, her presence transforming the scene from abstract debate to concrete reality. She stood straight despite the weight she carried, her face composed, her eyes challenging each man to see her not as a concept but as a person, not as a problem, but as a woman defending her unborn child against men who claimed to act in that child's interest while demonstrating none. She spoke in English, her words carefully chosen, her meaning unmistakable. She would not be taken, her child would not be stolen, and any man who tried would learn exactly how an Apache woman fought when cornered. The riders exchanged glances, their certainty eroding. This was not what they had been told to expect. The girl was supposed to be helpless, grateful even, eager to escape the clutches of a mad hermit. Instead, she stood defiant, protected not by force alone but by something harder to counter. Visible agency, clear will, the undeniable truth that she was choosing this, choosing Silas's protection over theirs. The legal papers seemed suddenly less substantial, their authority challenged not by argument but by presence, by a pregnant woman's refusal to perform the role of victim requiring rescue. The son-in-law retreated, gathering his papers with trembling hands, his face flushed with shame and anger in equal measure. He promised that this was not over, that higher authorities would be consulted, that force would be brought to bear. But the riders were already turning their horses, already calculating how to explain their failure to the Reverend and the captain, already revising the story to minimize their retreat. They had come for a simple extraction and encountered resistance they were not prepared in that moment to overcome. As the dust settled, Silas felt no relief, only a deepening certainty that the storm had merely been postponed, not averted. Zeta leaned against the doorframe, her strength finally giving way. Her hand pressed to her belly where the child kicked with what seemed like increased urgency. The confrontation had cost her, the stress triggering something deep within, some internal clock that marked the beginning of the end of her pregnancy. She looked at Silas with eyes that held no illusions. The child was coming soon, and when it came, they would be at their most vulnerable, trapped by biology and circumstance. The cabin that had been a sanctuary would become a prison, and the next time the men from New Canaan came, they would come prepared not just for resistance, but for siege. The days that followed carried a weight heavier than the oppressive desert heat. Silas worked with methodical purpose, reinforcing the cabin's defenses not with boards and nails, but with preparation for the ordeal he knew was coming. He gathered water from the seep 3 miles distant, storing it in every vessel he owned. He laid in supplies of clean cloth, of whiskey for sterilization, of the herbs Zeta had shown him possessed properties both painful and necessary. He checked and rechecked his ammunition, counted his cartridges, calculated the mathematics of defense against superior numbers. All the while, Zeta watched, her silence heavy with understanding that no amount of preparation could guarantee survival, only increase its possibility. In the quiet hours between sunset and full dark, they spoke more freely, the language barrier eroding as necessity bred invention. Zeta described her childhood, the freedom of growing up Apache, learning to read the land's subtle messages, to move through terrain others found impassable. She spoke of the man who had fathered her child, not with love, but with clinical detachment. A young warrior from a rival band, their brief union more about defiance than affection. A choice made in anger that had resulted in consequences neither had anticipated. His band had moved south into Mexico when her condition became evident, leaving her to face the judgment alone. The abandonment, she said, hurt less than the efficiency of it, the ease with which she had been excised from everything she had known. Silas shared his own history in fragments, pieces of a narrative he had never fully assembled even for himself. Emma had been more than his sister. She had been his responsibility after their mother's death, a weight he had accepted but never quite managed to carry. He had been away scouting when the preacher came through their town, away when Emma fell under the spell of eloquence and promises. He had returned to find her pregnant, their father's rage, the inevitable exile. He had tried to help, had found her a room in a town 40 miles distant, had promised to visit, to bring money, to ensure she never faced the ordeal alone. But the cavalry had called him away on a campaign that stretched weeks into months, and when he finally returned, Emma was 3 days buried, the child with her, both condemned by a system that valued judgment over mercy. What Silas did not say, what emerged only through the silences between his words, was that Emma had sent him letters during those final weeks, letters he had received too late, letters that described her fear, her growing certainty that something was wrong, her desperate need for the brother who had promised to be there. He had kept one letter, carried it in his shirt pocket until the paper wore thin and the ink faded, carried it still, a reminder of promises broken and debts that could never be repaid. When Zeta asked to see it, he hesitated, then handed over the fragile paper, watched her trace the faded words with gentle fingers despite not being able to read the English script. The letter's date caught her attention, held it. She asked when Emma had died, and Silas told her, March 17th, 1878. Zeta's expression shifted, something like wonder crossing her face. She was born, she said, on March 17th, 1867, the same date, 11 years earlier. In Apache tradition, such coincidences carried weight, suggested connections that transcended the physical world, binding souls across time and distance. Perhaps, she offered, Emma's spirit had guided Silas to this place, to this moment, to this second chance to save what he could not save before. Perhaps the debt he carried could finally be reconciled, the weight lifted through action rather than suffering. Silas did not believe in spirits or destiny, or the elaborate mythologies that various cultures wove to explain the random cruelty of existence. But he understood that belief itself carried power, that Zeta's interpretation of events gave her strength, and in the days ahead, strength would be the only currency that mattered. If she needed to see their meeting as fated rather than accidental, who was he to argue against a comfort he could not himself access? He had learned long ago that truth was less important than utility, that what helped you survive another day held more value than what could be proven or disproven. They fell into routines that approximated domesticity without becoming it. Zeta, despite her advanced pregnancy, insisted on maintaining her contribution to their shared survival. She prepared food with spices and techniques he had never encountered, transforming rabbits and desert plants into meals that carried flavors beyond simple sustenance. She repaired his clothing with such skill that tears and patches became nearly invisible. She spoke to the child in Apache, long monologues that Silas suspected were equal parts prayer, promise, and warning about the world waiting beyond the womb. In these moments, watching her hands rest on her belly, her face softened by anticipation despite everything, Silas felt something crack in the frozen center of his chest. Not love, nothing so simple, but recognition of shared humanity. The acknowledgement that isolation was a choice he had made that perhaps no longer served him. The cabin, which had been a fortress against the world, slowly transformed into something else, a home, perhaps, or at least the possibility of one. Silas found himself considering futures that extended beyond tomorrow's survival, thinking about how to teach a child to navigate between worlds, how to give them tools that would serve in both Apache and Anglo contexts. Zeta spoke of teaching the child her language, her stories, the names of plants and stars that carried meaning beyond their utility. They were planning, dreaming, making the fatal mistake of believing they might actually have time to see those plans realized. The warning came not from scouts or spies, but from the land itself. Ravens gathered in numbers unusual even for scavengers, circling patterns in the sky that Zeta read with the same skill she brought to tracking and weather prediction. Something large was coming, she said. Something that disturbed the natural order enough to set the birds on edge. Silas felt it too. A pressure in the air that had nothing to do with weather. A sense of impending confrontation that made his old wounds ache and his instincts scream warnings he had learned never to ignore. He checked the Winchester again, counted ammunition again, looked at Zeta's swollen belly and calculated timelines that refused to add up in any favorable equation. The dust cloud appeared at dawn 3 days later, larger than before, carrying not 12 men but what looked like 20 or more, a force assembled not to negotiate but to overwhelm, to take by strength what they had failed to take by words. At the head of the column rode Captain Bell himself, his cavalry blues identifying him even at distance, his presence transforming this from a civilian dispute into military action. Behind him came settlers, deputized citizens, and at least 2 men wearing the black coats and grim expressions of territorial marshals. This was not a posse anymore. This was an army, and they were coming to end the standoff once and for all with whatever force proved necessary. Zeta felt the first contraction as the riders entered rifle range. The pain arrived with the inevitability of sunset, a tightening across Zeta's belly that stole her breath and bent her double, hands clutching the doorframe for support. Silas saw it happen, saw the moment when biology overrode all other concerns, when the abstract threat of the approaching riders became secondary to the immediate reality of a child, demanding entry into a world already arrayed against it. He moved to her side, supporting her weight, guiding her back into the cabin's dim interior, his mind racing through calculations that all led to the same impossible conclusion. They were out of time, out of options, out of everything except the raw, stubborn refusal to surrender. The riders halted just beyond rifle range, a tactical decision that spoke to military discipline rather than civilian caution. Captain Bell sat his horse with the rigid posture of a man who had never questioned an order in his life, who saw the world in clear divisions between duty and dereliction, between the righteous exercise of authority and the chaos that waited when authority was challenged. He had brought overwhelming force not out of fear, but out of certainty. This would end today. The girl would be taken, the child delivered into proper hands, and Silas Thorne would answer for his defiance before a military tribunal. The fact that the girl was currently in labor complicated the timeline but did not change the objective. If anything, it simplified matters. A woman giving birth could not run, could not fight, could only submit to the inevitable. Inside the cabin, Zeta fought against submission with every fiber of her being. The contractions came harder now, closer together, her body following a rhythm older than any of the men gathering outside, older than their laws and their certainties, older than the conflict between Apache and Anglo, older than the territory itself. She gripped Silas's hand with strength that left his fingers numb, her nails cutting crescents into his palm. Her face sheened with sweat that reflected the thin light filtering through the cabin's single window. She refused to cry out, refused to give the men beyond the walls any audible confirmation of her vulnerability, channeling the pain into iron silence that spoke of Apache pride, and a will that could not be broken, even as her body was being torn apart by the act of creation. Silas understood that his skills, honed through decades of frontier survival, were useless here. He could track, scout, shoot, endure deprivation and hardship, but this was beyond him. a battlefield where knowledge and weapons counted for nothing against the primal force of life insisting on its arrival. He needed help, needed someone with the experience and knowledge that could mean the difference between survival and another grave carved into unforgiving ground. The only person within riding distance who fit that description was Mrs. Callahan, the midwife who served New Canaan and the scattered ranches beyond. A woman whose skill was matched only by her stubborn insistence on bringing babies safely into the world, regardless of whose babies they were or what circumstances surrounded their arrival. The decision to ride out was madness, but every option had narrowed to varying degrees of madness, and this at least offered a sliver of hope. Silas left the Winchester with Seta, showed her again how to work the lever, how to aim center mass, how to pull the trigger without flinching. She nodded understanding, her eyes fever-bright with pain and determination. If the soldiers came before his return, she would sell her life and her child's freedom as dearly as possible. They both understood this was not bravery, but mathematics. One life spent to purchase time for another life to enter the world free rather than in chains. The ride to New Canaan took 40 minutes that felt like hours, Silas pushing his horse harder than was wise, the animal's breath coming in ragged gasps as they thundered down the dusty trail. The town appeared ahead, its white buildings stark against the brown landscape, its church steeple pointing at a heaven that seemed very far away and very indifferent to the struggles of those below. Silas rode straight to Mrs. Callahan's house, not bothering to dismount, calling out with an urgency that brought her to the door, still wiping flour from her hands, her eyes widening as she recognized him and understood what his presence meant. She was a woman in her 60s, weathered by frontier life but unbroken by it, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched the severity of her expression. She had delivered 300 babies, she liked to say, and lost only 7, and every one of those 7 haunted her with the certainty that somewhere, somehow, she might have done something different, something better. She listened to Silas's rushed explanation with a face carved from stone, her eyes measuring him, measuring the situation, measuring the risk against her own rigid code of conduct that said babies deserved to be born alive, regardless of politics or race, or the complicated hatreds that divided people into tribes and territories. Her answer came without hesitation. She would come, but he should know that Captain Bell had personally warned her, not an hour before, that any assistance rendered to the Apache woman would be seen as obstruction of military justice. Mrs. Callahan, being Mrs. Callahan, had told the captain what he could do with his military justice. Using language that suggested her Irish heritage and her decades on the frontier, had left her with a vocabulary rich in creative profanity. She gathered her bag with practiced efficiency, instruments and medicines collected through years of experience, and climbed behind Silas on his exhausted horse without another word. The ride back revealed the siege in full formation. The riders had closed the distance, surrounding the cabin at 300 yards, their rifles visible but not raised, their posture suggesting patience rather than aggression. They were waiting, Silas realized, waiting for nature to do their work for them, waiting for the girl's screams to announce her complete helplessness, waiting for the child to arrive so they could claim it while it was still wet from birth, before any bond could form, before any argument could be made about the cruelty of separation. It was strategy refined to its cruelest essence. Use biology as a weapon, use a mother's vulnerability as leverage, use the arrival of new life as the tool to sever all previous life's connections. Mrs. Callahan took in the scene with one comprehensive glance, her mouth tightening into a line that suggested she had thoughts about military tactics and Christian charity that she would share later, in words that would blister paint. She dismounted without assistance, her bag clutched in one gnarled hand, and walked toward the cabin as if the surrounding soldiers were nothing more than inconvenient furniture. Captain Bell called out, ordering her to halt, reminding her of his warning. She turned, fixed him with a look that had cowed unruly fathers and nervous first-time mothers for decades, and informed him that she had been bringing babies into this world before he was born, and would continue doing so long after he was dead, and no tin-plated military popinjay was going to tell her otherwise. Then she turned her back on him and his authority, and walked through the cabin door, slamming it behind her with a finality that echoed across the yard like a judgment. Inside, Zita had progressed to active labor, the contractions now continuous, her body committed to a process that would not be stopped or delayed, that cared nothing for sieges or soldiers or the fate that waited beyond the cabin walls. Mrs. Callahan assessed the situation with clinical efficiency, barking orders at Silas in a tone that brooked no argument. Water, hot and cold both, clean cloths, whiskey, and for God's sake get out of her way and let her work. She turned to Zeta, spoke to her in a voice stripped of everything but competence and compassion, explained what was happening, what would happen, what needed to happen for both mother and child to survive. Language barriers meant nothing here. Tone and touch carried all the meaning necessary. The hours that followed became a blur of pain and effort, and Mrs. Callahan's steady voice guiding Zeta through the ordeal, telling her when to push, when to rest, when to gather herself for the next wave of agony that would bring the child incrementally closer to the light. Outside, the soldiers waited with the patience of men who believed time was on their side, who knew that eventually the door would open, the child would emerge, and their authority would reassert itself over biology and defiance alike. Captain Bell sat his horse like a statue, his face revealing nothing, his mind surely calculating how to spin this incident in reports that would climb the chain of command, how to transform a stubborn midwife and a defiant scout into dangerous radicals requiring the full weight of military response. The sun reached its apex and began its descent. Shadows lengthened across the yard. The soldiers shifted in their saddles, thirst and boredom eroding their initial vigilance. And inside the cabin, Zeta screamed finally, not in pain but in triumph, as the child emerged into Mrs. Callahan's capable hands, slick and red and howling its outrage at the cold shock of air, its lungs announcing life with a fury that penetrated the cabin walls and reached the ears of every man waiting outside. The sound was primal, undeniable, a declaration that regardless of politics or parentage or the uncertain future that waited, this child was here, was alive, was real. Mrs. Callahan worked with swift efficiency, cutting the cord, cleaning the infant, checking all the details that separated survival from tragedy. Girl, she announced, healthy, strong lungs, good color, all fingers and toes accounted for. She wrapped the child in clean cloth and placed her in Zeta's arms, watched as the new mother's face transformed, all the pain and fear momentarily erased by the overwhelming reality of the tiny, furious person she now held. Silas stood at the window, watching the soldiers, watching the child, feeling something indefinable shift in his chest. This was what he had failed to protect with Emma. This was the moment his sister had died reaching for. This was life, raw and messy and defiant, refusing to be denied even by an army. The standoff entered a new phase with the baby's first cry, the mathematics of violence suddenly complicated by the presence of an innocent so recently arrived that her existence seemed to demand acknowledgement even from the hardest hearts. Captain Bell dismounted finally, his boots raising dust as he approached the cabin with deliberate slowness, his posture broadcasting authority and reasonable resolution. He stopped 20 feet from the door, close enough to be heard without shouting, far enough to avoid provoking the desperate act he assumed Silas capable of committing. His voice, when it came, carried the practiced modulation of a man accustomed to command, reasonable and firm in equal measure. The captain offered terms. The woman and child would be taken to Fort Apache, where a doctor would examine both, where proper care could be rendered, where decisions about the child's future could be made by appropriate authorities rather than through defiance and violence. Silas Thorne would face questioning about his role in harboring a fugitive from Apache justice, but if he cooperated, charges might be minimized, his service to the territory taken into account. It was, the captain suggested, the best outcome anyone could hope for given the circumstances, the compromise that allowed all parties to retreat with honor intact. Inside the cabin, Zeta held her daughter. Mercy, she had named her already. The Apache word Ndeye whispered into the infant's ear like a blessing or a ward against evil, and calculated the value of the captain's promises against the certainty of what would follow. They would take the child. She knew this with the clarity that came from having watched her people's children disappear into mission schools and Christian homes. Their names changed, their language forbidden, their souls systematically erased and rebuilt in the image their captors preferred. Better, she thought, to die here fighting than to live, knowing she had surrendered her daughter to that fate. The Apache taught that life without honor was worse than death, that some things mattered more than survival. This child, warm and wailing in her arms, was one of those things. Mrs. Callahan, finished with her medical duties, positioned herself between Seta and the door, her body language making clear that anyone wanting to take the child would first have to go through a 63-year-old Irish midwife with opinions about military overreach and the proper treatment of new mothers. She called out to Captain Bell, her voice carrying the authority of 3 decades delivering babies in impossible conditions, asking him if he had ever witnessed a birth, if he understood the trauma it inflicted on a woman's body, if he possessed even the basic decency to allow mother and child 24 hours of recovery before demanding they be moved. The captain, unmarried and childless, possessed no such understanding but recognized a trap when he heard one, refuse her reasonable request, and every woman in New Canaan would hear about his callousness within a day. The negotiation continued, words flying back and forth across the 20 feet of dust-blown ground separating cabin from siege line, each side seeking advantage through rhetoric, while the real power lay in the rifles and the consequences of their use. Silas spoke little, letting Mrs. Callahan carry the verbal assault, but his presence at the window, his Winchester visible, provided the subtext that gave her words weight. He would not fire first, but he would fire, and the captain knew enough of Silas's reputation as a marksman to understand that the first volley would be costly, regardless of the inevitable outcome. The sun continued its descent, painting the desert in shades of amber and shadow, and with its movement came a subtle shift in the besiegers' certainty. Men began to exchange glances. Quiet conversations occurred between soldiers and deputized citizens, and the unified front of righteous authority developed fractures that widened with each passing minute. Several of the townsmen had wives, had children, had attended births in their own homes and remembered the primal fear and wonder of those moments. Looking at the cabin, imagining what had just occurred inside its walls, made the military necessity feel less necessary and more like an act of cruelty they would have to live with, would have to explain to their own families, would have to justify to themselves in the years ahead. One rider turned his horse and departed, then another, then a third. Captain Bell, recognizing the erosion of his force, demanded they hold position, reminded them of their duty, their oaths, the chain of command that made his orders absolute. But duty proved a weaker force than conscience, and oaths carried less weight than the image of a new mother defending her hours-old child against an army. By dusk, the captain's force had dwindled to 6 soldiers and 2 civilians, men whose ideology burned hot enough to override empathy, whose certainty remained intact despite the cracks appearing in everyone else's resolve. Reverend Price arrived as the last light faded, riding hard from New Canaan with reinforcement in the form of righteousness, rather than men. He positioned himself beside the captain, his voice rising in impromptu sermon, calling down God's judgment on those who would protect savagery, who would choose Indian welfare over Christian duty, who would stand between the innocent child and salvation. His words had power, the practiced power of years spent swaying congregations, but here in the gathering darkness, facing a cabin that had become fortress and sanctuary both, his rhetoric seemed to deflate, to lose substance against the simple reality of a woman nursing her child, of a man standing between that woman and harm, of a midwife who had delivered half the children in New Canaan, choosing to defend an Apache mother over military authority. The night brought cold clarity. Captain Bell, consulting in low tones with Reverend Price, made his final offer. They would withdraw tonight, allow mother and child to rest, but would return at dawn with full military force and a legal writ from the territorial judge. If the woman and child were not surrendered voluntarily at that time, the cabin would be taken by force, with all consequences falling on Silas Thorne's head, including charges of sedition, harboring fugitives, and armed resistance to lawful authority. It was, he said, the last chance for resolution without bloodshed. After tonight, the choice would be out of his hands, out of anyone's hands except those who commanded regiments and dispensed territorial justice. Silas accepted the terms without speaking, his silence serving as both agreement and defiance, acknowledging the postponement while promising nothing about the dawn. The soldiers withdrew in good order, maintaining discipline despite their diminished numbers, riding back toward New Canaan and Fort Apache with promises to return in force. Reverend Price departed last, his horse's hoofbeats fading into darkness. His final words a promise of prayer for the souls of all involved, though his tone suggested he was praying for Silas's damnation rather than salvation. In the cabin's quiet aftermath, Mrs. Callahan examined Seta again, pronounced both mother and child stable, then turned to Silas with eyes that had seen too much of human nature to retain illusions about happy endings. The captain would keep his word, she said. He would return at dawn, and next time he would come with orders that permitted no negotiation, no mercy, no quarter for defiance. Seta had perhaps 12 hours with her child before the world came to take her away. Mrs. Callahan could stay, could provide what comfort her presence afforded, but she could not prevent what dawn would bring. No one could. The hours before dawn became a vigil, each person in the cabin wrapped in their own thoughts, their own calculations about what the morning would demand. Seta nursed Mercy, memorized every detail of the infant's face, whispered stories in Apache about grandmothers the child would never meet, about a people and a way of life that would exist for her only as stories, as fragments, as the phantom heritage that might surface in dreams she would not understand. Silas cleaned weapons he would not use, knowing violence would serve no purpose except to guarantee Seta and the child's immediate seizure, knowing surrender was inevitable, but unable to stop his hands from their practiced motions. Mrs. Callahan dozed fitfully in a chair, exhausted by the day's exertions but unable to truly rest, her mind turning over possibilities that all led to the same destination. Dawn arrived with the inexorable certainty of all natural phenomena, indifferent to human drama, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed mockingly beautiful, given what those colors announced. The dust cloud appeared as expected, larger than the previous day's force, carrying what looked like a full cavalry platoon, plus additional territorial marshals and, improbably, a territorial judge in a wagon, brought along to lend immediate legal authority to whatever seizure was about to occur. This was overwhelming force married to overwhelming bureaucracy, the combined weight of military and civil authority focused on one cabin, one woman, 1 hours-old child. But as the force approached, a second dust cloud appeared from the opposite direction, and from it emerged a sight that stopped everyone in place. A dozen Apache warriors, riding in loose formation, weapons visible but not raised, led by an elder whose gray braids and bearing suggested status and authority. They halted between the cabin and the approaching soldiers, their positioning making clear that any assault on the cabin would require going through them first. How they had learned of Seta's situation, what had brought them here, what authority had sent them. These questions hung in the air unanswered as the two forces faced each other across 100 yards of desert, the mathematics of violence suddenly recalculated by this unexpected variable. The Apache elder dismounted, walked alone toward the cabin, his movements unhurried, his purpose clear. He spoke to the closed door in Apache, identified himself as Mountain Who Stands Still, headman of Seta's former clan, come to take her and the child back to the people, back to the protection of the tribe. Her exile, he said, had been reconsidered. The child changed everything, represented new life for a people being ground down by starvation and reservation boundaries. They would take mother and child, protect them, raise the girl in the old ways. The white man's law had no authority over Apache decisions about Apache people. The standoff had become a three-way confrontation, each side holding cards, but none holding a winning hand. Each capable of inflicting damage, but none capable of achieving victory without costs that suddenly seemed too high. Captain Bell, Recognizing stalemate, made the calculation that had eluded him the previous day. This battle, even if won, would cost more in blood and political fallout than it was worth. He ordered his men to stand down, turned his horse, and rode away, taking with him the judge and the marshals and the full weight of Anglo authority, choosing retreat over Pyrrhic victory. The Apache elder waited, his offer standing, his patience the patience of mountains watching valleys erode. But from the cabin came not Seta, but Silas, carrying the child, Seta walking beside him on shaking legs, Mrs. Callahan supporting her other side. They stopped halfway between cabin and warriors, and Seta spoke in Apache, her words carrying clearly in the morning silence. She honored the clan's change of heart, she said, honored their willingness to reconsider. But she had found a new clan here, had found protection when her own people had offered none, had found a man willing to risk everything, not for personal gain but for honor, for the memory of another child who had died, for the simple principle that those who needed protection deserved it regardless of race or history, or the convenient absolutes of tribal or territorial law. Her daughter, she said, would grow up between worlds, would learn Apache and English, would walk in two cultures, would carry within her the possibility of bridge building rather than perpetual war. The elder listened, his face unreadable, then nodded once, acceptance or understanding or merely acknowledgement of her choice. He mounted his horse, gathered his warriors, and rode back toward the Chiricahua Mountains, leaving behind no promises but also no threats, leaving the space for Tseta to choose her own path, even if that path led away from the people. 5 years moved across the Arizona territory like wind over sand, reshaping boundaries without erasing the essential nature of the land beneath. The cabin stood unchanged in its fundamentals, but transformed in its details. A newer roof, a larger corral, a garden plot where Tseta coaxed vegetables from reluctant soil, using techniques that blended Apache knowledge with Mrs. Callahan's Irish stubbornness. The old midwife had become a frequent visitor, her presence providing both practical assistance and a bridge to New Canaan, where attitudes toward the strange household had evolved from open hostility to wary acceptance to, eventually, a grudging respect for people who had carved out their own definition of family in defiance of everyone's expectations. Mercy grew like desert wildflowers after rain, fiercely, unexpectedly, with a beauty that owed nothing to conventional standards and everything to the unique circumstances of her creation. At 5, she moved between English and Apache with the fluidity of a child who recognized no boundaries between languages, who understood that her mother's words and Silas's words and Mrs. Callahan's words all carried meaning without needing to be translated into a single dominant tongue. She had her mother's dark hair and eyes, Silas's stubbornness, and a spirit entirely her own that manifested in fearless exploration of the desert around their home, in questions that challenged every adult assumption, in a laugh that could transform the cabin's serious atmosphere into something approaching joy. Silas had aged into the role of father without ever claiming the title, teaching the child to track and hunt and survive not because he expected she would need those skills but because they were the only gifts he knew how to give. He showed her how to read the morning's dew patterns to predict wind direction, how to distinguish between the tracks of different animals by the depth and spacing of prints, how to move through arroyos and up cliff faces without disturbing stones that might betray your presence. Mercy absorbed it all with the intensity of a child who understood, without being told, that knowledge was survival, that the world beyond the cabin required skills her Anglo peers in New Canaan would never need to develop. Tseta taught different lessons, equally essential. She showed Mercy the stars and their stories, the constellations that guided travelers and marked the seasons, the celestial maps that had guided her people for generations beyond counting. She taught plant knowledge, which roots could heal, which leaves could harm, which flowers announced water nearby, which berries carried poison despite their tempting appearance. She taught the Apache concept of harmony, the understanding that humans existed as part of the land rather than separate from it, that respect for all living things was not sentiment but survival strategy. that the desert's harsh beauty demanded acknowledgement rather than conquest. Mrs. Callahan, when she visited, brought books and demanded Mercy learn to read them, arguing that a child who could speak 2 languages should be able to read at least one. The English lessons occurred on the cabin's porch, Mercy sounding out words while her mother prepared meals inside and Silas worked in the corral. The domestic routine a silent rebuke to those who had predicted chaos and failure for this unconventional arrangement. The old midwife had become something between grandmother and fierce advocate, showing up uninvited but always welcome, bringing news from New Canaan that ranged from mundane gossip to important intelligence about territorial politics that might affect the household's precarious position. The territory itself had changed, though whether for better or worse depended on perspective. The Apache Wars had ground toward their inevitable conclusion, Geronimo's surrender marking the end of organized resistance, though small bands still fought in Mexico and isolated corners of the borderland. New Canaan had grown from settlement to town, its church steeple now flanked by 2 stores, a telegraph office, and a school that Reverend Price hoped would serve as civilization's forward outpost. The Reverend himself had softened slightly, age and experience teaching him that rigid certainty sometimes broke against reality's more complex truths, though he still preached damnation for those who strayed from prescribed paths and still considered Silas's household an affront to proper order. Captain Bell had been reassigned to New Mexico, replaced by a younger officer whose enthusiasm for frontier warfare had not yet been tempered by the grinding reality of fighting an enemy who knew the land better than his maps could ever show. The new captain had visited the cabin once, making the obligatory assessment of a potential threat within his jurisdiction, and had departed satisfied that Silas Thorne posed no danger to military operations. The old scout had aged into a rancher, the dangerous edges worn smooth by domestic life, the perpetual vigilance redirected from military threats to the more mundane dangers of raising a child in country that could kill through carelessness as easily as through malice. But the core truth of their situation remained unchanged. They lived in the spaces between worlds, claimed by neither Anglo nor Apache society, tolerated by both but fully accepted by neither. Mercy would grow into this liminal existence, would learn to navigate its challenges, would perhaps eventually forge connections that transcended the artificial boundaries adults erected to separate one kind of human from another. Or perhaps she would fail, would be crushed between cultures that could not reconcile, would pay the price of her parents' defiance. The future refused to reveal its intentions, remaining as inscrutable as the desert itself, promising nothing except that survival would require constant adaptation to changing conditions. On an evening in late autumn, with the first cold edge of winter sharpening the air, the 3 of them, Silas, Tseta, and Mercy, stood outside the cabin watching the sunset paint the western mountains in shades of copper and rust. Mercy held her mother's hand and Silas's hand simultaneously, her small fingers linking them in a chain that symbolized something stronger than blood, deeper than law, more enduring than any institution's recognition. She pointed at stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky, reciting their Apache names with the confidence of a child who had never been told her heritage was something to hide or be ashamed of, asking questions about which stars guided travelers and which ones simply watched without offering direction. Tseta answered in the patient voice of a mother teaching essential knowledge, while Silas remained silent in the comfortable way of a man who had learned that presence counted more than words, that showing up day after day, year after year, choosing to stay when leaving would be easier, carried more weight than any proclamation of commitment or love. He thought about Emma sometimes, wondered what she would make of this unlikely family, suspected she would approve of the way he had honored her memory by preventing another child from being taken, by standing firm when standing firm, required defiance of everything he had been taught to respect. The desert cooled rapidly as darkness deepened, temperatures dropping toward frost, and they turned back toward the cabin and its warmth. Inside, a fire waited, and a meal, and the comfortable routines of a household that had earned its right to exist through sheer stubborn refusal to collapse under pressure, external and internal. Mercy ran ahead, her energy undiminished by the long day, already planning tomorrow's explorations, already certain that the world existed for her discovery rather than her defeat. Her confidence was her parents' greatest gift and greatest gamble, confidence that she belonged, that her existence required no justification, that the complexity of her heritage was strength rather than weakness. In the years that followed, Mercy would indeed face challenges that tested that confidence, would encounter prejudice from both Anglo and Apache communities, would struggle to define herself in a world that demanded simple categories and rejected nuance. But she would also carry within her the memory of this evening, of standing between two people who had chosen each other and chosen her, who had risked everything to create space for her to exist, who had refused to let either church or cavalry or tribal judgment dictate the terms of her belonging. That memory would sustain her through doubt and difficulty, would remind her that family was not about blood or convention, but about the daily choice to protect and defend and love those who needed protecting, defending, and loving. The frontier would continue to close, its wild spaces domesticated by railroad and telegraph, its indigenous peoples confined to reservations, its violent freedom replaced by the rigid order of statehood. But in the small corners, in places like Silas's cabin, different stories unfolded. Stories about people who refused to accept the boundaries drawn by those who claimed authority, who built bridges instead of walls, who demonstrated through their living that human connection transcended the categories society used to keep people separate and manageable. And perhaps in the end, that was the most important legacy any parent could give a child. The evidence that the world could be different than what authority decreed. That courage sometimes looked like standing at a cabin door with a rifle, and sometimes looked like nursing a newborn, while an army waited outside. That redemption was not about grand gestures, but about the accumulation of daily choices to honor the past's debts, while refusing to let those debts destroy the future's possibilities. Mercy carried all of this within her, written not in words but in the memory of hands holding hers as stars emerged above the desert, in the memory of a mother's stories and a father's silent presence, in the knowledge that she had been fought for, had been worth the fight, had been born into a love that required no name because it existed in actions rather than declarations. The cabin's door closed against the night's cold. Inside, light and warmth and the sounds of a family doing what families do, eating, talking, preparing for tomorrow, taking for granted the miracle of their existence while the desert outside bore witness to their defiance, their survival, their refusal to let a hostile world dictate the terms of their belonging. And if that was not triumph in the conventional sense, if their story would never be told in territorial histories or celebrated by either culture that had tried to destroy them, it was triumph nonetheless, the kind that mattered most because it was measured not in victories over enemies, but in the simple continuation of life, of love, of the stubborn insistence that mercy, both the virtue and the child, had a place in even the harshest landscape. The desert remembered everything and forgave nothing, but it also provided, for those who learned its lessons, for those who respected its power, for those who understood that survival required adaptation rather than conquest. Silas and Seda had learned those lessons, had taught them to their daughter, had created from nothing a space where belonging required no permission, where family needed no official recognition, where love existed in the space between words, in the gesture of a rifle raised to defend, in the choice to stay when everyone expected flight, in the daily renewal of a commitment that had begun in desperation and evolved into something that approximated hope. And hope, in the end, was the greatest defiance of all. Hope that tomorrow would arrive, that the child would grow, that understanding would eventually triumph over fear, that the world's capacity for cruelty would be matched by its capacity for mercy, not the arbitrary mercy of institutions, but the hard-won mercy of individuals choosing compassion over judgment, choosing protection over condemnation, choosing to see humanity in those whom society had already written off as other, his enemy, as unworthy of the most basic consideration. If one cabin in the Arizona Territory could house such hope, If one family forged from rejection and defiance could survive and even thrive, then perhaps, just perhaps, the future held possibilities beyond the narrow definitions of those who claim to speak for God, for country, for civilization itself. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggle, marking time in rhythms that made individual lives seem insignificant. But inside the cabin, significance was measured differently, in heartbeats and breaths and the warm weight of a sleeping child, in the quiet understanding between two people who had found each other when finding anyone seemed impossible, the knowledge that they had changed nothing and everything, changed nothing about the territory's brutal trajectory toward what it would become, changed everything about who they themselves had been before that abandoned wagon, before that choice to stop rather than ride past, before that moment when the past's failure demanded redemption in the present's action. And so they lived, and so they would continue living, one day at a time, one choice at a time, building their improbable family in defiance of all reasonable expectations, proving through their existence that love required neither law nor approval to be real, that family was what you fought for rather than what you were born into, that home was not a place but a feeling, not a location but a commitment, not a structure, but a choice renewed daily to stand beside those who needed standing beside, to protect those who needed protection, to offer mercy in a world that seemed to have forgotten what the word meant. That was their legacy, their triumph, their quiet revolution against a world that had tried to break them and had discovered too late that some things refused to break. Some bonds held fast despite all pressure. Some love endured despite every effort to destroy it. The night deepened. The fire burned low. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own choices, its own opportunities for courage or cowardice, for connection or isolation, for mercy or judgment. But tonight there was peace, there was warmth, there was family, and that was enough. That had always been enough. That would always be enough.